You feel it, don't you? That creeping sensation that you're falling apart, that your life is dissolving into chaos, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Everything you built is crumbling. Everything you believed is shattering. But here's what you need to understand. This isn't a breakdown. This is the beginning of the great work, the Magnum Opus. And Jung discovered that what seems like your destruction is actually the first stage of becoming complete. What if I told you that alchemy was never about gold? That every strange symbol, every cryptic recipe, every bizarre instruction about lead and mercury was actually a code for something far more valuable than metal. Jung spent years decoding these ancient texts, and what he found changed psychology forever. The alchemists weren't trying to create gold. They were mapping the exact process of human transformation. They were describing how a broken person becomes whole. And here's the terrifying part. Most people get stuck in the first stage and think their life is over. They experience the darkness, the dissolution, the complete collapse of everything they thought they were. And they stop there. They accept that broken state as their final form. But Jung discovered that this darkness is just the beginning. It's the necessary fire that burns away everything false so something real can emerge. The alchemists called this journey the Magnum Opus, the great work. And Jung realized it wasn't about substances in a laboratory. It was about the human psyche undergoing a complete transformation, from unconscious to conscious, from fragmented to integrated, from lead to gold, from the person society shaped you to be to the person you were born to become. This isn't self-help. This isn't positive thinking. This is the ancient map of how consciousness evolves, how the human psyche reorganizes itself at the deepest level. The alchemists encoded this process in symbols to protect it from misuse. Jung decoded their language and translated it into psychological terms we can use. So here's what that actually means for you. When your life falls apart, when you feel like you're dissolving into nothing, when depression hits so hard you can barely function, you're not broken, you're in stage 1. And if you understand what's happening, if you can recognize the pattern Jung discovered, you can move through all 4 stages and become the person you were always meant to be. Let me show you something the ancient alchemists knew that modern psychology is only now beginning to understand. The path to becoming whole isn't gentle. It doesn't start with affirmations or positive thinking. It starts with complete destruction. Nigredo, the blackening. This is the first stage of the Magnum Opus, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Everything turns dark. Your relationships fall apart. Your career crumbles. The person you thought you were dissolves like sugar in water, and you're left standing in the ruins, wondering what happened. Jung saw this pattern over and over in his patients. People would come to him in this blackened state, depressed, lost, convinced they were fundamentally broken, and Jung would tell them something that seemed crazy at the time. He'd say, "This darkness you're experiencing, this is necessary. This is the fire that burns away the false self." Imagine someone who spent decades building a career they never wanted, climbing ladders they never chose, impressing people they never liked, and then one day, it all collapses. That's Nigredo. That's the blackening. That's the moment when everything false gets burned away. Here's what's actually happening during Nigredo. Your ego, that constructed version of yourself that you've been maintaining for years, is being destroyed. All those masks you wear, all those personas you present to the world, all those lies you tell yourself about who you are, they're being burned away. And it feels like death, because in a very real sense, it is death. The death of the false you. Jung documented this in his own life. After his break with Freud in 1913, Jung entered his own Nigredo. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. For 6 years, he descended into darkness. He experienced visions that terrified him. He heard voices. He felt like he was going insane. His career was in shambles. His reputation was destroyed. Everything he had built was turning to ash. His colleagues thought he had lost his mind. His family worried he would never recover. Night after night, he descended into active imagination, dialoguing with unconscious figures that seemed more real than waking life. He filled journals with paintings that looked like madness, but he kept going. But here's what Jung understood that saved him. This wasn't mental illness. This was transformation. The old Jung, the Jung who needed Freud's approval, the Jung who played it safe, the Jung who followed the rules, that person was dying, being burned away in the alchemical fire of Nigredo, and something new was trying to be born. Think about this in your own life, that depression you're experiencing, that feeling of emptiness, that sense that nothing matters anymore. What if it's not a disease? What if it's your psyche burning away everything that isn't authentically you? What if all those things you thought you wanted, all those goals you were chasing, all those identities you were clinging to, what if they were never really yours to begin with? Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. Nigredo strips all of that away. It's the psychological equivalent of burning a field so new crops can grow. The old growth has to die. The soil has to be cleared. And yes, it looks like destruction. It feels like death. But it's preparation. It's making space for something real to emerge. The alchemists understood this. They knew you had to start with base material, with prima materia, with chaos. You had to let everything dissolve into blackness before you could begin the work of transformation. They weren't talking about lead in a crucible. They were talking about your life when it falls apart. They were talking about hitting rock bottom. They were talking about the dark night of the soul. And here's the crucial part Jung discovered. You cannot skip Nigredo. You cannot avoid it. Every attempt to bypass the darkness, every attempt to stay positive and ignore the dissolution, every attempt to hold on to the old self, it only prolongs the suffering. The fire will burn until everything false is consumed. Fighting it just means you burn longer. So when you feel yourself entering this darkness, when everything starts turning black, when you feel like you're dissolving into nothing, remember this. The alchemists called it Nigredo for a reason. It's the necessary first stage, the foundation. Without this burning away, without this dissolution, transformation is impossible. You're not falling apart. You're being prepared. But here's what happens next. After the burning, after the dissolution, after everything turns to ash, something extraordinary occurs. The alchemists called it Albedo, the whitening, and this is where most people finally take their first real breath. Albedo is the moment of clarity. After all that darkness, after all that suffering, after everything has been burned away, suddenly you can see clearly. The chaos of Nigredo gives way to a strange kind of peace, not happiness, not joy, just clarity, pure, crystalline awareness. Jung described this stage as the washing away of the blackness. Imagine taking something that's been burned, that's covered in soot and ash, and carefully, methodically washing it clean. What emerges is something purified, something essential, something real. This is when you stop blaming the world. This is when you stop making excuses. This is when you finally look in the mirror and see yourself clearly for the first time. And what you see is your shadow. Everything you've been denying about yourself, every quality you've been projecting onto others, every part of yourself you've been refusing to acknowledge. You see the rage you've been suppressing, the desires you've been denying, the selfishness you've been projecting onto everyone else, the cruelty you claimed you didn't possess, the manipulation you swore you'd never use. All of it rises to the surface in Albedo. And instead of drowning you like it did in Nigredo, now you can actually see it, examine it, understand it. Here's what makes Albedo so powerful. In Nigredo, you're just suffering. You're just burning. You don't understand what's happening. But in Albedo, understanding arrives. You start to see why everything had to fall apart. You start to recognize the patterns. You start to understand which parts of your life were authentic and which were just performances. Jung had his own Albedo moment. After years of darkness, after years of feeling like he was losing his mind, suddenly the vision started to make sense. The voices started to become coherent. He began to understand that what he was experiencing wasn't madness. It was the unconscious trying to communicate. It was his psyche reorganizing itself at a fundamental level. And this is what happens in Albedo for everyone. After the chaos of Nigredo, patterns start to emerge. You begin to see that your depression wasn't random. It was a response to living a life that wasn't yours. You begin to understand that your relationships fell apart because they were built on false foundations. You begin to recognize that your career crumbled because you were chasing someone else's definition of success. Albedo brings insight. It brings understanding. It brings a kind of relief that's different from happiness. It's the relief of finally seeing clearly, of no longer being confused about what's real and what's performance, of understanding, perhaps for the first time, who you actually are beneath all the masks. The alchemists knew this stage was crucial. They called it the whitening because it represents purification. All the impurities burned away in Nigredo. Now you're washing clean what remains. You're separating the essential from the unnecessary. You're discovering your authentic self beneath the layers of conditioning and expectation. But here's the thing about Albedo that Jung emphasized. This insight, this clarity, this understanding, it's necessary, but it's not enough. You can see clearly now. You can understand your patterns. You can recognize your shadow. But understanding isn't transformation. Knowing yourself isn't the same as becoming yourself. This is where many people get stuck. They achieve insight. They go to therapy. They read books. They understand their childhood wounds and their defense mechanisms and their attachment patterns. And they think that's the goal. They think that understanding is the finish line. But Jung discovered something crucial. Insight is just stage 2. You're only halfway through the transformation. Because now comes the stage that most modern psychology completely ignores. The stage that even many Jungians skip over. The stage the alchemists called Citrinitas, the yellowing. And this is where insight transforms into wisdom, where understanding becomes power. Citrinitas is the solar dawn. After the darkness of Nigredo and the clarity of Albedo, light finally breaks. But this isn't the light of understanding. This is the light of awakening. This is when consciousness itself shifts. When you don't just know yourself, you become yourself. Jung described this stage as the moment when the unconscious contents you've been observing suddenly integrate. They stop being problems you're analyzing and become powers you're embodying. All that shadow material you recognized in Albedo, in Citrinitas, you integrate it, you own it, you transform it from something that controlled you into something you consciously wield. Here's what this looks like in practice. In Nigredo, you felt rage but couldn't control it. It consumed you. In Albedo, you understood where that rage came from. You could trace it back to childhood wounds. You could see the pattern. But in Citrinitas, you learn to use that rage. You transform it into fierce boundaries, into righteous anger against injustice, into the fire that fuels your purpose. This transformation isn't metaphorical. It's psychological alchemy in the most literal sense. You're taking raw emotional energy that was destroying you and transforming it into something that serves your authentic self. In Nigredo, You felt shame about your desires. They overwhelmed you. In Albedo, you understood why you were taught to be ashamed. You could see the conditioning. But in Citrinitas, you reclaim those desires. You integrate them. You allow yourself to want what you want without apology or explanation. This is the yellowing, the golden dawn, the moment when all those dark parts of yourself that you discovered in Albedo stop being problems and become powers. The moment when your shadow becomes your ally, when everything you were taught to reject about yourself becomes your greatest strength. Jung experienced this in his own transformation. After understanding his visions, after recognizing the patterns, he began to work with them. He started active imagination. He began dialoguing with these unconscious figures. He stopped being overwhelmed by them and started collaborating with them. The chaos that nearly destroyed him became the foundation for his life's work. Think about what this means. The same material that was destroying him in Nigredo, that he was observing in Albedo, he was now using consciously in Citrinitas. The archetypes that terrified him became his guides. The shadow that threatened to consume him became his ally. The unconscious that felt like an enemy became his collaborator. This is what Citrinitas offers: conscious power, not the unconscious power that controls you, not the understanding that observes you, but the integrated power that flows through you. This is when you stop being a victim of your psychology and become a master of it. The alchemists emphasized this stage because they understood something crucial. Gold isn't created by understanding lead. Gold is created by transforming lead. Insight alone doesn't make you whole. Integration does. Taking everything you've learned about yourself in Albedo and consciously incorporating it into who you are. That's the work of Citrinitas. And here's what makes this stage so powerful. Once you integrate your shadow, once you own all those rejected parts of yourself, you become dangerous to manipulators. You become immune to gaslighting. You become impossible to control because you're no longer split. You're no longer at war with yourself. You're unified. You're whole. You're conscious. But even this isn't the final stage. Even with all this integration, even with all this conscious power, there's still one more transformation. The final stage of the Magnum Opus. The stage the alchemists considered the ultimate achievement. Rubedo, the reddening. And this is where you finally create the philosopher's stone. Rubedo is the union of opposites, the marriage of consciousness and unconsciousness, the integration of all the fragmented parts of yourself into a unified whole. This is what Jung called the self with a capital S. This is psychological completion. In Rubedo, something extraordinary happens. All the work you've done in the previous stages culminates in a fundamental shift. You're no longer a person trying to become whole. You are whole. The split between who you think you are and who you actually are dissolves. The gap between your conscious mind and your unconscious mind closes. You become integrated at the deepest possible level. Jung spent his entire life studying people who achieved this stage, and what he found was remarkable. These people had a quality that was hard to define, but impossible to miss. They were unshakable, not because nothing bothered them, but because they couldn't be pulled off center. They had found their core and built their entire life around it. They were complete. They had integrated all their contradictions. They could be gentle and fierce, compassionate and boundaried, loving and ruthless. They contained multitudes because they had integrated all the parts of themselves that society had told them to choose between. These people moved through the world differently, not because they were perfect, but because they were whole. They had stopped fighting themselves. They had stopped pretending. They simply existed as integrated beings. And here's what made them truly powerful. They were dangerous to anyone who tried to manipulate them, not because they were aggressive or defensive, but because they saw through manipulation instantly. They recognized every psychological game because they had integrated their own capacity for those same games. They had owned their shadow so completely that they could see everyone else's. When someone tried to guilt them, they saw it. When someone tried to gaslight them, they recognized it immediately. When someone tried to manipulate them emotionally, they felt it before the manipulation even completed. Not because they were paranoid, but because they had integrated these same capacities in themselves. They knew every trick because they had owned their own trickster. This is the philosopher's stone, not a physical object, not a mystical artifact, but a human being who has completed the great work, someone who has moved through Nigredo's darkness, Albedo's clarity, Citrinitas' integration, and emerged in Rubedo as a complete, conscious, integrated self. Jung believed this was the goal of human development, not happiness, not success, not comfort, but completion, wholeness, the integration of all the parts of yourself into a unified, conscious being, the transformation of lead into gold, the creation of the philosopher's stone. And here's the beautiful part. This person, this integrated self, doesn't withdraw from the world. They don't become a hermit or a sage on a mountain. They engage with life more fully than ever before. But they engage consciously, purposefully, from a place of wholeness rather than woundedness. They love deeply but without losing themselves. They fight fiercely but without being consumed by rage. They create abundantly but without attachment to outcomes. They live fully but without fear of death, because they've already died in Nigredo and been reborn in Rubedo. So let me bring this all together. The Magnum Opus, the great work, the 4 stages of inner transformation that the alchemists mapped and Jung decoded. This is the journey from fragmentation to wholeness, from unconsciousness to consciousness, from suffering to power. You start in Nigredo, everything falls apart, everything turns dark, the false self burns away, and you think it's the end, but it's just the beginning. Then comes Albedo, clarity emerges, understanding arrives, you see yourself clearly for the first time, you recognize your patterns, you discover your shadow. Next is Citrinitas. Integration happens, insight becomes power, understanding transforms into wisdom. You don't just know yourself, you become yourself. Finally, Rubedo, the union of opposites, the marriage of consciousness and unconsciousness, the creation of the philosopher's stone, complete, whole, integrated. And the gold the alchemists were really seeking, it wasn't metal, it was the self, the complete, integrated, conscious human being that emerges from this process. That's the treasure. That's what makes the great work worth doing. Here's what you need to understand. The world doesn't want you to complete this journey. The world benefits from your fragmentation. Society needs you unconscious. The system depends on you staying stuck in Nigredo, suffering but never transforming. Or maybe reaching Albedo, understanding but never integrating. Because a person who completes the Magnum Opus cannot be controlled. They cannot be manipulated. They cannot be sold dreams that aren't theirs. They cannot be convinced to live lives that don't belong to them. They are psychologically sovereign, and that terrifies every system built on unconsciousness. But you have the map now. Jung gave it to us. The alchemists preserved it for centuries in their cryptic texts. The 4 stages are clear. Nigredo burns away the false. Albedo brings clarity. Citrinitas creates integration. Rubedo achieves completion. The question isn't whether you'll enter Nigredo. Life will bring you there eventually. The question is whether you'll recognize what's happening, whether you'll understand that the darkness isn't the end, whether you'll have the courage to keep going, to move through all 4 stages, to complete the great work. Because here's the truth Jung discovered. You were born to do this, not to stay comfortable, not to avoid suffering, not to maintain the false self forever. You were born to transform, to become whole, to create the philosopher's stone of your integrated self. And every moment of darkness, every moment of pain, every moment when you feel like you're falling apart, it's all part of the process. It's all necessary. It's all leading you toward completion if you understand what's happening. The alchemists left us the formula. Jung decoded the language. The map is complete. The path is clear. Now it's just a question of whether you'll walk it, whether you'll do the great work, whether you'll transform your lead into gold. If this resonates with you, if you recognize yourself somewhere in these 4 stages, leave a comment sharing where you are in the journey. Are you in the darkness of Nigredo, the clarity of Albedo, the integration of Citrinitas, or have you experienced the completion of Rubedo? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you want to continue exploring Jung's map of human transformation, subscribe to this channel, because we're going deeper. We're unpacking every stage. We're revealing every secret the alchemists encoded and Jung decoded. This is just the beginning. In the alchemist's path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get the Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.